From a TikTok trend to real life situations, here's what you need to know about red flags. So, have you ever seen that trend on TikTok? It was from a while ago now, but I think it's still there. Of that filter that you could like see what your red flags were, and then there was like beige flags,
Yeah.
and then there was green flags, and like
So many
while I
different
think it's
flags.
hilarious, so many different flags. I think it's hilarious because ones that would come up is like I'm lactose intolerant, but I will still eat cheese, or like you won't hear from me past 8 p.m. Like those are definitely mine.
I'll be
And
like
while I think it's like
sad
fun,
and like I'll be sad, but I'll be listening to like sad music on top of that. And it's like, yeah.
yep, sorry. And I think it's fun and playful to do these things, and there's a place and a time for them. But we see this in social media as it intersects with mental health all the time now, that it can heavily misconstrue what maybe red flags actually are for people that are in relationships that might lean towards the toxic side because of these red
Yeah.
flags. I was in a relationship in my early 20s, super toxic relationship, but I just failed to see or acknowledge those red flags in the beginning. And as I got deeper into the relationship, I acknowledged them and like recognized that maybe this wasn't how things were supposed to be, but I didn't know what to do with it. So I was just like, okay,
Yeah.
this is just how my relationship is going to go. And I have to adapt to those red flags. But what started
Mm.
happening is I started isolating myself from like family, from friends, and making excuses for their behavior and, covering up their behavior and accepting verbal abuse, accepting physical abuse, all those mind games that just sent me into a very heavy depression and state of anxiety after those few years.
Yeah.
So, my question to you, as someone who works with individuals and women in relationships that might also see this, why is it so easy to ignore those red flags, maybe from the onset or even when you're deeper in it? Why is it so hard to just stop yourself and be like, this is not okay? I cannot do this, or this is wrong?
Yeah. I think the first thing about this is it might not be safe to in those moments to
Yeah.
leave, to stand up, to right. And
Hmm.
if we think about it from like it can be a in some ways an adaptive response to try and stay to fix to placate to people please in those moments
Yep.
because it's the safer option.
Hmm.
That's not to say that long term that's going to be the safer option, but in that moment in time it might feel like this is what I can do to keep myself safe from it escalating or for it getting worse. And what might start off as, oh, this person is really, really into me, really intensely, they want to
Hmm.
spend all their time with me, it can quickly sometimes turn into this piece around, wait, where did all my friends go?
Yep.
Where's my family? Where am I in this?
Yeah. And that became
It
my
can,
fault too. So I think there's a
yeah,
sense of when these red flags appear, there's this like slight manipulation that's going to come along with it because all these
yeah,
things suddenly became my fault of why these red flags were popping up.
yeah.
So I
Got
think
turned
that
onto you, like it became
too,
a shame thing.
it becomes shame. And you just like don't want to label it because then you're going to believe that, oh, like maybe they're right. Like maybe that, like I
Yeah.
was overthinking or I am in the wrong here. So I'm going to continue to ignore this red flag because it's my fault. Like I have to accept
Right,
that.
right. Again, like there's what we know about shame is it can be a really isolating feeling.
Hmm.
It can lead to I don't want to go there. I don't want to reconcile if this is actually about me. If I'm causing this behavior of like this otherwise wonderful person, and
Yeah.
I'm the reason that they're acting this way.
Yeah.
Um, and again, like it can feel like that's the safe response to do,
Hmm.
but these red flags are hard, right? Like they
Yeah.
don't the reason that they can often show up is because they can be gradual. They can be like they at the beginning they might look a little bit more yellow, a little bit more amber of like, like this is interesting, but it's not
Hmm.
like a glaring red flag. So
Right.
I can go
Yep.
into it a little bit more.
Yep.
Um,
And then you find
but
yourself stuck, I find, right? Like you're just like,
yeah,
then you're just so in it and you're like, okay, how do I even get myself out of this? And then with that, what is the work, I guess, someone could do to start acknowledging these a little bit more, like building the confidence to say something about them
yeah,
when they're starting to notice that they're getting deeper and deeper into something that they feel is wrong?
right. I think there's definitely a line I think between what might be like an abusive situation where it would definitely look a lot different. But
Yeah.
if we're noticing, let's say, patterns with a partner around communication, around just like something that's not sitting right, I think
Hmm.
that the first part of that is acknowledging for yourself that something's up, right? I think
Yeah.
what you were saying earlier, just around like it's
Hmm.
sometimes even hard to work up the courage to say, this isn't sitting right. Like this, and I'm gonna name the fact that this isn't what I thought. This isn't where I want to be. That's the
Yeah.
first, and sometimes it can take a really long time to get to that point, right? Like of
So long.
just pure acknowledgement, right? Because
Yep.
it's a really scary thing to be like, this is not the relationship that I wanted. This is actually unhealthy for me.
Hmm.
Um, and then once that comes, that's when we can start figuring out, okay, what do you want to be doing? Because ultimately it's not about what friends, family, whoever's going to
Yep.
say. It's about ultimately what you want, what you're comfortable doing.
Yeah.
um Again, when there's safety concerns, it's a little bit of a different conversation.
Yeah.
um but even just like around behaviors that you might not be liking in a partner, okay, so then what do you want? Is it something that you want to address in the relationship? Is it something that can change? Or is this
Yeah.
a red flag, get out, like this person's not going to change? Or
Right.
is this something that we can address together if we're talking about it?
Totally. And I think you just addressed it too. Like it takes time to filter through those stages, I think. Cause when I think back to like mine, I think like I didn't see them because they weren't there, and then they started
Yeah.
appearing because that's just the nature of who this person was, and it just
Yeah.
took time for that to show up, and then I was someone at the time who doesn't have the, like, inner strength and confidence and empowerment that I do now that I learned from that situation. So I was very much like, "Oh, like, okay, like, I'm just gonna stop this, like, this is my fault, I'm so sorry," and you just fall into these patterns of starting to acknowledge that like this just isn't right, and you're waking up crying, you're going to bed crying, you're feeling like you're constantly walking on eggshells, or you're so
Yeah.
scared to say something because it might set them off and they're not going to talk to you tomorrow, or you're blocked suddenly, or suddenly his car's outside your house, you're like, why are you here? Like all these types
Yeah.
of things that are the signs of red flags and the toxicity that you can see in relationships, and it's hard to break that cycle. It takes time.
Yeah. It takes time, and I think a lot of compassion for yourself in that too, right?
Yeah.
Recognizing I'm maybe part of this cycle, but I'm not the full person here. Like I'm not the full responsibility here, right? Like we
Yeah.
can own that there's multiple responsibility, multiple buckets of responsibility of, what's my responsibility, what's their responsibility, and what's our shared responsibility.
Hmm.
And even within that acknowledgement, again, that self-compassion of, okay, I recognize that there's some faults here.
Yeah.
They happen. Let's figure them out and let's see where we can go without this lens of like self blame of like I'm the problem. There's only like a very like black and white way of thinking about it.
Yeah. And I think like you just touched on again too, sorry, is there's work afterwards. So when
Yeah.
I was out of this relationship, I was not better. Like I felt almost worse, right? Because then you
Yeah.
just lost that like codependent
Yeah.
thing almost.
Yeah.
But then I wandered into therapy and things just started to make sense. And one thing that my therapist said to me was that like you can't change the way they think. And I don't know why, but it just landed with me that I was just like
Yeah.
hearing that from someone else was just like helpful to be like, okay, I'm not this person who just like thinks like how can I not possibly influence him to change? Like what's wrong with me that I can't do that or make that happen?
Yeah.
So there's work outside, and that took a long time. Like I would say like I wasn't in a state of feeling different or new or refounded probably until 2 years after. So
Yeah.
it takes time to, then accept that that even all happened, that those red flags were there, and what that all
Yeah.
actually meant when you're outside of that state. I find looking in. Is that some of the conversations you might have with your clients, and like what does that work kind of
Yeah.
look like for you or with you
Yeah.
in
I
sessions?
think that that's a really incredible point there of excuse me, it's not just about the in the moment, survival and getting out. There's a
Hmm.
lot of learning and unlearning and acceptance about, what's happened in the past. How do we reconcile that this happened? I'm not condoning it. I'm not okay with what happened, but it is what happened.
Hmm.
I think that makes me think a lot about, the importance of processing what happens
Yeah.
after the fact, right? Like
Yeah.
when we're in the moment, when we are in a difficult or traumatic situation, we're not really reprocessing in that moment,
No.
right? Like we're just in a
Mhm.
state of survival. The
Yeah.
reprocessing comes later when the foundations of even safety are there, right? Like
Yeah.
that needs to be inherently there before anything else.
Mhm.
Um, and it makes me think a lot about EMDR, so eye movement desensitization and reprocessing is a form of trauma therapy that I have training in, and this idea of the work can come after, right? Like how do we originally look back at these like negative beliefs about ourselves, about the situation that we were in, and how can we move towards something that's more adaptive so that our brain can actually process what happened and put it to rest so that it's not front and center all the time, especially as, potentially like embarking on new relationships, so that it's not right here when I'm getting to know someone new, that I don't have
Yeah.
this recurring belief of like, I'm the problem, I'm never going to have a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
Realizing, you know, again, like I may have had a fault or some responsibility in it, but I'm not the problem, right?
Yeah.
Like I didn't, I'm not I'm not like a faulty person because I couldn't get this person to understand
Yeah.
that, that those were the boundaries, or that was something that I wasn't going to stand for in a relationship.
For sure. And I think something too, I'll only speak on this for myself, but I do think it could be widely seen as this way as well. This work that you're talking about and the work that I personally did too is such a beautiful thing. And something else that you, once you're maybe out of that therapy, like you can look back in and just again connect those pieces a little bit more of like,
Yeah.
okay, like that wasn't me. And like I wasn't wrong to think that way. And, this is not who I am as a person. Like this is not going to label me for the rest of my life. And you start to find yourself. And when people have this vision of themselves as the best version that they can be when they come out of this work. Like it's just so exhilarating and freeing and so lovely to take yourself out of that and continue on with this best version of yourself. So I think the work specifically for these things that you do in therapy can go no wrong.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's such an honor and such a privilege to be part of, like with, with some of
Hmm.
the individuals that I'm working with,
Yeah.
just being part of that journey, part of,
Yeah.
like kind of like what, the way that you described it, what your therapist said that really clicked with you. It's a privilege to be in that
That
position and to be
person.
able to
Yeah.
have sometimes, sometimes it's not anything that I say and something that the client might say and
Yeah.
hear themselves say out loud. It's like, oh, wow, like that was really powerful stuff. Sometimes
Hmm.
it could be me, but I think even just being in this space with people as they're doing this work is truly like the biggest honor of my life and that.
Yeah. I love that because I think for me, again, personally, like my parents were supportive and they were trying to get me out of it. I didn't see that until I was actually out of the relationship, but they
Yeah.
also let me lead it.
Yeah.
Obviously, they didn't want to see me the way I was being, but there's this thing where they just like, you need to figure this out for yourself. Like, we're not going to say anything that's going to change your mind. My friends, he's a piece of shit. Like, why are you staying here? Like, I don't understand like why it's so difficult for you to see this. And then, you're isolated from them. So they don't even care to tell you anymore. So I think when you take yourself out of that situation, you put biases aside, sit down with a therapist who doesn't have a like understanding of this person and
Yeah.
like clear understanding of you just yet. Like it just takes that bias out of it. And for me, I just like honed in immediately on what they were saying because they weren't my mom or dad, because they weren't my
Yeah.
best friend. It was easier to hear them for me. So I
Yeah.
think that's a great thing about working with a therapist too, is that they're just there to be your champion, hear you, and that's it.
Well, and they're
For you,
here
help you.
for you and with you, right? Like it's not a situation where I would say typically like we're gonna be like piling up on your ex and saying like, no, this is really like,
No, that's
we
yeah,
can acknowledge the effect that it has on you and what we see in session.
yeah.
But I think that that's the difference, right, between the people who are in your life and see you day in, day out versus a therapist who's also seeing you, let's say once a week or once every few weeks. We're here with you, we see what we see in the moment.
Hmm.
Um, I would say that as part of like my like profession, like we ultimately do have the ultimate concern for the client in that, but we're humans too, right? And we get
Hmm.
to connect on a human level about this.